Hello and welcome to our mini lecture on geologic natural hazards with a focus on volcanoes. In this picture we see Norris Geyser Basin at Yellowstone National Park, and all the steam you see coming up are those geysers that are being fueled by the supervolcano that is underneath Yellowstone National Park. We worry about volcanoes, of course, because they're very explosive. And so an example of this would be the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington State in 1980. This was a huge eruption in which 57 people lost their lives, and so much ash, and that you can see that in the picture here with all the ash that's coming out of that volcano. So much ash came out of the volcano that if you try to put it on top of a football field, it would be 150 miles high. So this ash spread over many states, and it was a huge volume of ash. This leads us to the question about why are we concerned about volcanoes? Of course, if you're in the immediate vicinity of a volcano, you might have different concerns than if you're further away. In the immediate vicinity, you're worried about things like lava flows, avalanche from debris, and that happens whenever the volcano erupts and you have all this debris coming down the side of the mountain, and then explosive blasts and flying rocks. All of these can bury people, animals, entire streams, forests, and bridges. In terms of widespread issues, if you're further away from the volcano, you still need to worry about noxious gas emissions and airborne ash clouds. These can both cause breathing problems, but they can also damage airplanes and cause unsafe flying conditions. And so an example of this is the flight KLM 867, which was flying into Anchorage, Alaska in 1990, soon after Mount Redoubt, which is a volcano housed in Alaska, erupted nearby. At this time, the plane flew through the ash cloud. All four engines were clogged and failed. The airplane did glide for several minutes without any engines, luckily because there were 240 passengers aboard that flight. They did get one of the engines started up and right like soon after, and then another engine. They had enough engines restarted so they could safely land the airplane. But now we ground flights whenever there's an ash cloud en route so that flights are not in danger of this ash cloud. So do we need to worry about volcanoes in the United States? So maybe most of you've never been to Alaska, you think I don't care about that. But the United States is actually one of the most volcanically rich countries in the world. We have 169 active and dormant volcanoes, and this represents 11% of all of the world's active volcanoes. Excuse me. The U.S. is also home to the world's largest active volcano, which is in Hawaii, it's called Mauna Loa. Hawaii and Alaska do have the highest density of volcanoes in the United States, and since 1980, there have been 45 different volcanic eruptions at 33 different volcanoes. So some of these volcanoes have actually erupted more than once since 1980. So where do we find volcanoes? They tend to be found at plate boundaries, so where different plates are intersecting. So you might have an oceanic plate being subducted underneath a continental plate. That leads to volcanoes, or if you have two continental plates colliding, that can lead to volcanoes. We see the most volcanoes in the ring around the Pacific Ocean called the Ring of Fire. So this is not just a Johnny Cash song, it's actually a geologic feature, and this is where most of the volcanoes in the world are. We also, though, see volcanoes at hot spots around the world, and these are places where you have a magma chamber relatively close to the surface, but it's not related to any kind of plate subduction or plate boundary. And so we see these in places like Hawaii, Iceland, and Yellowstone. These are not plate boundaries necessarily, we just have a hot spot or a magma chamber close to the surface that keeps fueling volcanoes in those areas. In this picture you can see the Ring of Fire, and if you see all these little red dots In the diagram, these are volcanoes. These are active volcanoes. And so we see the highest density of volcanoes in this picture in that ring of fire which surrounds the Pacific Ocean or the Pacific Plate. Are there different types of volcanoes? Yes. Very generally speaking, and geologists probably wouldn't like my generalization here, but volcanoes that are found under that where the lava is escaping um, through continental crust tend to be much more explosive because as that magma comes to the surface, it is a more viscous magma. It's mixing with the continental plate composition, and so it tends to flow more slowly, and sometimes it cools and hardens before it even comes out of the ground. And so you tend to have these shells forming on top of the magma chambers. And so when the magma does come out as lava, it has to burst through that hardened top, and so it's very explosive. Volcanoes that are under oceanic crusts are less explosive. This lava is less viscous, it flows more freely, and it doesn't have to break through that hard crust. And so it just kind of bubbles up from the magma chamber out to the surface. So an example of this would be Kilauea in Hawaii. And in this volcano, the lava just freely flows to the surface and out. I'm including a diagram from the USGS that shows you the different types of volcanoes, just so in case you are interested in learning about the different types. And as we discussed, shield volcanoes, like what we see in Hawaii, are less viscous, and they're near the top of this diagram, being some of the least explosive volcanoes. And then calderas, so Yellowstone is an example of a supervolcano caldera. These are the most explosive of all volcanoes. So thanks for listening and have a great day.